In the middle of a deserted road, a woman staggered forward, her hair a tangled mess, her clothes torn to shreds. Her bare feet sank into the thin layer of snow, leaving behind a trail of smeared blood. She barely had time to lift her head before collapsing at the edge of the road, her breathing rapid and on the verge of stopping. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered nearby, whispering as if they were looking at a broken object rather than a human life. Probably some piece of trash that washed up from who knows where, someone muttered. No one stepped forward. Then came the sound of horse hooves. Elias Boone appeared at the far end of the road. A tall man, his face weathered by the sun, eyes gray like cold steel. He pulled the reins slowly, his icy gaze resting on the trembling body lying on the ground. After a few seconds of silence, Elias dismounted. He knelt down, his calloused hand gently turning the woman's shoulder. Her breathing was shallow, her lips a purplish blue. In that moment, Elias's eyes softened just slightly, not out of pity, but as if he saw a shadow of his own darkness reflected in her. Without saying a word, he lifted her into his arms, placed her on the back of his horse, and turned straight toward the cabin outside of town. The crowd murmured behind him, but Elias never looked back. The creaky wooden door opened. The fire in the hearth waited to be stoked, and on that freezing night, the fates of two strangers crossed paths: a solitary rancher and a woman burdened by a castaway past. The cabin door shut tight, sealing the bitter wind outside. Inside, only the soft crackle of firewood filled the silence. Elias laid the woman down on an old blanket spread out in the horse stable next to the house. It used to be a place for storing hay, but now it had become a temporary shelter. He was not used to having strangers in his cabin, especially not a woman. She was still not fully conscious. Her breathing was labored, and the air carried a faint scent of dust and dried blood. Elias stoked the fire again, left a bowl of water and a piece of dry bread by her side, and quietly returned to the cabin. The wooden door slammed shut, sealing a thick wall of silence between them. The next morning, when Elias went out to the cattle shed, he saw the bowl empty. The bread had been partially eaten, with crumbs scattered around. The woman was awake, sitting curled up in the blanket, her dark eyes locked on him with cautious alertness, like a wild animal cornered with no way out. Elias said nothing, asked nothing. He simply left a bit more food and went on with his daily chores. Day by day, the silence settled in like routine. Elias rarely stayed near, and Mara Lil, he had learned her name from a few whispered words during her fevered sleep, never stepped out of the stable. From time to time, he heard her coughing softly, or the faint clink of a spoon against a bowl. Those small sounds, though quiet, made the cabin feel less empty than it had in years. One night, as the wind howled through the cracks in the door, Elias saw her huddled near the fire in the stable. The firelight flickered across her pale face, her eyes strangely bright through the smoke. He watched her for a while, then turned away, letting the silence speak for them both. Neither of them mentioned the past, nor asked about the future. The cabin stood still through the harsh winter, sheltering just two souls, one in the light, one in the shadows, sharing the same roof. And in that quiet, no one knew that the fragile seed of connection had already begun to take root. One morning, Elias opened the stable door and saw the blanket folded neatly, and the crumbs from yesterday's bread completely gone. He paused, his eyes drifting to Mara Lil, who was awkwardly trying to gather some hay into a small pile. The gesture was clumsy, but Elias said nothing. He simply gave a small nod and quietly carried his bucket off to fetch water. That afternoon, when Elias returned after a long day out in the fields, he noticed that the porch had been swept clean. His thick, worn coat was neatly hung back on the wooden hook, instead of being tossed carelessly on the table like usual. For the first time in many years, the house showed signs of a woman's touch. Elias looked around, his lips pressed into a firm line, saying nothing, but his gray eyes softened ever so slightly. The next day, Elias prepared a pot of thin soup, like he did every winter. But when he came to set it on the fire, he found a pot already steaming on the stove with some wild greens and dried beans inside. Mara sat quietly in the corner, her eyes lowered. Elias took a spoon and tasted it. The flavor was plain, but warm. He said nothing, offered no praise or complaint. He just added more wood to the fire and let the soup continue to simmer. That night, the sky was thick with gray clouds, and the wind howled around the cabin. Elias sat at the wooden table, a bowl of soup in front of him. Mara stood just outside the doorway, hesitant. Her hand trembled as it touched the doorframe, as if afraid to cross an invisible line. Elias looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers, then tapped gently on the chair across from him. The moment stretched long, like a lifetime. At last, Mara stepped inside and sat down. The two of them stayed quiet. The only sound was the clink of spoons against bowls. But this silence was different from the days before. It no longer held tension. It felt like two strangers slowly learning to accept one another's presence. When Mara set her spoon down, Elias noticed that her dark eyes no longer looked away. The firelight flickered across the room, making the cabin feel strangely warm. For the first time in many years, the meal was not eaten alone. And just like that, the brittle silence began to crack, making way for a single, small step that would quietly reshape the lives of two people forever. Snow fell thick, burying the narrow trail that led out to the fields. Elias decided to stay in the cabin all day, feeding more firewood into the stove. Mara sat near the hearth, her thin hands spread toward the flames, the warmth casting soft light on her weathered face. They had grown used to silence, but today, it felt heavier than usual. It was Mara who broke it first. Her voice was hoarse, like it had been scraped raw by the winter wind. I used to be the property of a rich man. To him, I was no different than a horse, a saddle, just something to show off. Elias paused in the middle of sharpening his knife and looked up. His gray eyes were still as stone, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of lightning passed through. Mara continued, I ran away. He called it betrayal, and since then I have not had a place to return to. When people look at me, all they see is trouble. The crackle of firewood filled the pause that followed. Elias did not ask questions, nor did he show pity. He simply pushed a thick cloak toward her. Mara hesitated, then took it. A moment later, Elias spoke, his voice dry as desert wind. I once had a family. My wife was kind, and our son was just 6 years old. Then the sickness came. Within a week, they were both gone. I buried them behind the hill, and from that day on, I never cared to speak to anyone again. Mara looked up, her dark eyes deep and still. 2 stories, a woman treated like property. A man who lost everything to fate suddenly intertwined in that small, quiet room. No one cried. No one reached for the other. There was only silent acknowledgement, like old scars turned upward to the firelight. Elias turned his face away, his hand tightening around the knife handle. Mara pulled the cloak tighter around herself. But inside that lonely cabin, for the first time, neither of them felt alone in their pain. Thank you for being here. If this story brought back memories of the old days of dusty afternoons and the sound of hoofbeats echoing in your chest, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together again. And I will tell you another story from the west. Outside, the wind howled through the rows of pine trees, sending swirling waves of snow across the hillsides. Elias Boone's cabin stood firm amid the blinding white, a thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney, a fragile sign of life in the wilderness. That night, Elias sat at the table, his rough hands sharpening a hunting knife. The firelight flickered across his face, tracing the deep lines carved by years of wind and Sunday. His eyes stared into the distance, but he was not truly seeing, just a cold emptiness stretching back to the day he lost his wife and child. The wooden door creaked open. Mara stepped inside. She no longer hunched the way she used to. Slowly, she walked toward the fire. Her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor, quiet but distinct. Elias glanced at her, then looked back down, continuing to sharpen his blade. He had grown used to the silence and assumed it would simply continue. But Mara did not stop in the far corner like before. She sat down beside him, close enough that Elias could hear her soft breathing, could see her hands calloused, but trembling slightly from the cold. No words were spoken, only the crackle of burning wood and the sharp scent of pine resin in the air. Then Mara held out a wooden cup. Inside was warm water she had poured earlier. Elias looked up, caught off guard for a moment. She said nothing, simply placed the cup on the table and gently slid it toward him. He took it and drank a sip. In that brief moment, he felt warmth spread from the cup to his hands, and from his hands to somewhere deeper. A small act of kindness, but enough to make the cabin feel a little less cold. Elias set the cup down and looked at Mara. Their eyes met in silence. No thank you. No explanations. Just a quiet acknowledgement that somehow they were no longer strangers. The night wore on, and the wind still howled outside. But inside, the silence no longer felt like a chasm between them. It had become a shared rhythm, making the little cabin feel just a bit larger. And in that moment, an invisible seed had taken root, something neither Elias nor Mara fully recognized yet: connection. Winter had not yet loosened its grip. Snow still covered the path leading into the town of Bentwood Flats. Elias and Mara quietly continued their life on the ranch, gathering firewood, tending to the skinny cattle, waiting for the snow to finally stop. Life was harsh, but peaceful until one morning, when Elias went into town to trade some cowhide for salt and dried beans. As he stepped into the saloon, the atmosphere shifted. In the far corner, a tall man in an expensive fur coat sat with a glass of whiskey. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw Elias. Then came a cold smirk, followed by a deep, gravelly voice. "I heard you are harboring a woman who belongs to me." The entire saloon turned to look. Elias stood tall, his gray eyes cold as steel. He did not reply immediately. He simply set the sack of cowhide on the counter and poured himself a glass of water. The man stood up, moved closer, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "Mara Lil." She ran off. "But what belongs to me does not get to walk away." His name was Roy Haskins, a wealthy horse trader known for his ruthlessness. Everyone in town knew it, no one dared interfere. Elias looked him straight in the eye and said calmly, "No one on my land is property." The words dropped like a hammer into the heavy air. Roy let out a mocking laugh, but there was a flash of anger in his eyes. He leaned in, speaking just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "If you do not give her up, your land will not stay quiet for long." Elias said nothing more. He turned and walked out. The wooden door slammed shut behind him, leaving only tense stares and murmurs of fear. Back at the cabin, Elias told Mara everything. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across her face. Mara said nothing. Her hands gripped the blanket tightly, her dark eyes stormy and deep. "He will not stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Elias said, slowly adding more wood to the fire. "But this is your home. No one has the right to take you from it." Mara looked up, and for the first time, her eyes held not just fear, but a flicker of pride. That night, snow fell thick outside, but inside the cabin, they were ready. They knew the ghost of the past was not just knocking, it was about to break down the door. The day the snow stopped falling, the sky was thick and gray, like a heavy curtain hung low. Elias rode his horse down to town with a few sacks of barley. Mara asked to come along. She wore Elias's old heavy coat and walked beside him, shoulders squared, eyes steady. It was the first time she had stepped out of the shadow of the cabin to face the world on her own terms. When they reached Bentwood Flats, a crowd had already gathered in front of the saloon. Roy Haskins stood at the center, cracking a riding crop like it was a symbol of power. His voice rang out, "She is mine. A runaway piece of property has no place being sheltered. Hand her over, Boone, if you want to keep your peace." The townsfolk stayed silent, eyes downcast. Everyone knew Elias was a loner, with no kin and no allies. No one wanted trouble, and no one wanted to cross Roy. Elias led his horse a few steps forward. His voice was low but clear, cutting through the cold wind. "Mara is not property. She is a person, and from this day on, she lives in my home." Murmurs swept through the crowd like waves breaking against a wall of silence. Roy's face turned red. He slashed his whip into the snow, his voice a growl. "You looking to make enemies of this whole town?" Mara stepped up, standing beside Elias. Her face was thin, but her eyes burned bright. She spoke, her voice rising clearly for the first time before a crowd. "I am not a possession. I chose to stay. And if anyone sees me as a problem, look me in the eyes and say it." The silence stretched long and heavy, until even the sound of the wind slipping past the rooftop seemed loud. Not a single person in the crowd responded. They saw, clearly, the strength of a woman who had spent a lifetime surviving and now stood tall without flinching. Roy stepped forward, his hand brushing the grip of his gun. The air went tight as a drawn bowstring, but Elias did not reach for his own weapon. He simply stood there, tall and unmoving, like an old oak tree bracing for a storm. His steel-gray eyes never wavered. That silence crushed the aggression. Roy hesitated, and then, perhaps realizing that pulling the trigger would make him a coward in front of the entire town, he stopped. He spat into the snow and gave a bitter laugh. "Fine. Let us see how long you can keep that peace." Then he turned his horse and rode off, leaving a tense stillness behind. The townspeople remained silent, but in their eyes, the scorn was gone, replaced by something closer to respect. Elias tightened his grip on Mara's hand. Without a single shot fired, they had already won. Winter slowly retreated, the ice melting into small streams that trickled through the rocks. Out in the fields, soft patches of green began to push through the soil, signaling the start of a new season. Elias Boone's cabin was no longer a lonely fortress. It had become a home marked by the sound of a second set of footsteps. Marilil could still leave. Every time she stood on the porch, looking out toward the horizon, Elias knew that. The prairie stretched far and wide, and 1,000 paths opened at the edge of the world. But that morning, as he fixed the broken fence, Mara stepped out carrying a bundle of hay. Her voice was steady and clear. "I am not going anywhere. I am staying. This is my home." Elias said nothing. He simply nodded and handed her the hammer. Together, they nailed the loose boards back into place. The sound of hammering echoed through the crisp morning air, a sound that confirmed her decision was not just words, but a beginning. In the days that followed, they planted seeds in the small garden outside the cabin. Mara turned the earth, her strong arms and broad shoulders glistening with sweat under the spring Sunday. Elias followed, dropping corn kernels and beans, one by one. They worked like a pair who had known each other for years, every movement in quiet rhythm. And that silence, for once, was filled with peace. At night, they sat by the fire and shared a bowl of bean stew. Mara no longer looked away from Elias's eyes, and Elias, for the first time, smiled a real smile. Rare, but enough to light up the entire cabin. One afternoon, they led the cattle to graze on the fresh green pasture. The spring wind brushed their faces, carrying the scent of damp earth. Mara walked beside Elias. Her eyes no longer held shadows, only the sparkle of a sunlit stream. Elias stopped, staring out at the horizon burning with the colors of sunset. Mara leaned gently against his shoulder. No need for promises, no need for titles. In that moment, they both knew they had found what had once seemed lost forever. A home, and someone to share it with. Out here in the West, they say freedom means being alone, tied to no one. But Elias and Mara had learned a different truth. Real freedom is not solitude. Real freedom is choosing to stay beside someone not because you must, but because you want to. The small cabin still stood in the middle of the wide open prairie, chimney smoke curling into the sky quietly, letting the world know that two outcasts had finally found where they belonged. Dear friends, the dust may rise, the guns may fire, and silence may follow, but only love can keep a person standing. You do not need fancy vows, only two hearts willing to stay. Love out here in the hard land is not flashy, but it is steady like stone, warm like fire in the cold night, and worth holding on to till the very end. I love you all, my dear listeners of Wild West storytelling. Wherever you are, I hope you are safe, and I hope you are happy. Tell me what you felt about this story. Leave a comment down below. Tap 1 if you liked it. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next thrilling story from the Wild West.